It's for real.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Nostalgia Crackdown here on the Let's Get Ready Network. I'm Adelia. That's my buddy Josh. We cover the Movie Trivia Schmoedown in retrospective form, and this month we are talking about the evolution of the manager. Josh, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. We got an interesting comment. By the way, this topic was commented on one of our other videos. Like, hey, you should do an episode on this, and we are going to be doing an episode on this for sure. And I'm happy to do it because it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, the role of the manager definitely evolved over the seasons of the Schmoedown. Kind of really became a real focal point during the faction era, but managers were around for quite a while before that. So, Josh, how about we get started?
Absolutely. So I think part of the reason the manager evolved so much was because the sport, the Schmoedown, evolved. At the beginning, the manager, it feels like the manager's role very much was a mouthpiece for the competitor, if you will. They were mostly like 90 to 95% there for the entertainment. And that shows by the popular managers of that time. You had Finstock of the Lions Den, Ricky Hayberg, Jade Washington, Ken Knapsack, all those like during that time when they were managing at the beginning of the Schmoedown throughout the first couple of seasons, it felt like their main purpose was to get hype for their match, bring their competitors up, and maybe for some competitors who aren't as comfortable on the mic, they can give those competitors they don't let those competitors fall behind because they are doing the mic work for them in some ways or helping amplify their competitors might work in different ways. It felt like their main role was specifically for promos and for the rivalries and entertainment of the match rather than the actual strategic and like match play. It felt like the managers just did their thing and then the competitors also did their own thing, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense because, like, the first manager that comes to mind when we talk about the early managers in the Schmoedown is Finstock, Tom Dagnino, whatever he was going by that week because it varied. And he was more there to further the storylines than he was to actually help out during matches. There was no like set role for the manager within a match. There were no challenges yet. There was none of that. And Dagnino forming the Lions Den is one of the memories. I think was that the first spectacular when that happened. I want to say, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. We're gonna have like factions now, and of course the faction needs like the guy that leads it. And I thought it was interesting that they went with Dagnino for that. But it became clear that he was very, very good at helping the Patriots.
Absolutely. And another thing you'll notice about the early part of the managerial when it comes to this is having a manager was the minority. The majority of competitors did not have a manager. If you look at this time period,
Yeah.
it was more rare to have a manager than it was to not have a manager. And that's because the manager was just an add on, at least at this point, in my opinion. It wasn't like something that's needed within the game. There's no competitive disadvantage for the manager. If you didn't have a manager, which we'll see later on, the managers become commonplace and mandatory because of how the Schmoedown changed to a sport in some ways. But you have so many times where there would be no managers in a match or a manager versus someone who's just completely unmanaged. And the fans also weren't being like, oh, I wonder if this manager is going to pick this player up. It was very commonly assumed. Oh, they're not going to. I mean, like, only a few players really get picked up for a manager. There was even like factions where there was no manager, like the Horsemen. The Horsemen was a faction without a manager, unless you count Roka the manager. But even then, like, it felt like they were just four competitors kind of like all being co-managers in some way or just kind of coming together. Roka was clearly the lead, but no one, I think, would in that time would call Roka a manager, even though was the lead of a faction of the Horsemen.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And then you look at people like Jay Washington, who came in as a manager, and he, joined up with Janine, and I was like, oh, he can really help this new player to the game. And that's when I started to see like the role for the manager from a strategic point of view, was when Jay Washington came in, because before that it was just like Finstock was with the Lions Den, that was all storyline based. Ricky Hayberg doing whatever it was he was doing with Critically Acclaimed, that was pretty much all storyline based. Bibbs breaking away from the Horsemen. But Jay Washington coming in, even though there was a lot of storyline stuff around Jay Washington, and then with Janine and with Stacy and Brienne, but with Janine, it was the first time I was like, oh, I see now how the manager can help a newer player to this environment or this game settle down, prepare and get used to what they're doing in the Schmoedown.
Absolutely. And I think after once we get to the Jay Washington, and we put Ken in this group because it feels like Ken's kind of like a second manager of the Lions Den, and that was also a storyline thing where betraying Rachel and joining the Lions Den and having a heel turn was all storyline. But after that, we kind of see a turning point where we don't go all the way, but the Schmoedown becomes a bit more competitive. People are now really studying for it, and the gameplay is really advancing. And that's what's going on in the sport in general. And with the manager, I think the first person and really the clear person we see of the new evolution of the manager is Emma Fythe, which we had a whole
Absolutely.
episode about the Fythe Club. But we have these new managers where it's a mix of the old and new, it feels like. We have Emma Fythe, we have Roxy, we have Robert Meyer Burnett, and we have Grace Hancock, who is co-manager with Ken in Corruption. And I think really why Emma shows the turning point of the starting to become a new type of manager and a new role for the manager is because it felt like she was one of the we always credit Ben Bateman to a lot of the studyification of the Schmoedown in a lot of ways where competitors are studying and thinking of the strategy of the game and kind of almost like this new way of thinking about the game as a sport. But I think Emma's also a huge part of that because the way that her faction got together and started studying, and I think Mark and Draco and the Fight Club do talk about how before big matches they would practice with the buzzers, which I'm not sure if any other manager at that time before a championship match would take their competitors and practice with the buzzers. Emma made sure when her competitors had a championship match, practice with the buzzers. We're going to get together and quiz each other and get better. And that seems like a commonplace thing in the new Schmoedown. But at this point, that wasn't a commonplace thing. I think Roxy, we even see a bit of that with the Odd Couple. Although I'm interested to hear the behind the stuff behind how the Odd Couple first started working together. I wonder because we get a lot about the Fight Club and how they got together and started studying. We get a lot about Ben Bateman studying and a lot of the new factions how they started studying together. We don't hear much about Roxy when it comes to that period when she first started managing the Odd Couple. So I'm interested to see how involved and if there was study sessions between Draco and Snyder and stuff like that. And I assume there might be just because Draco's comes from the Five Club where they did do that. But it felt like having Roxy in your corner not only helped with the mic stuff because the mic stuff with Emma and Roxy were still very good, but also they were very tuned into the challenging and they were very tuned in strategically. It felt like, oh, having these players in your corner gives you an extra edge competitively. And as the Schmoedown was getting more competitive, that it mean the manager had to evolve to a way to help their players because managers are always there to help their players in a way. And the new way at the beginning, the only way they could help their players was to help them with the storylines, create storylines that gives them more focus and be more of a presence within the storyline and within the mic. Now, in this new version of the Schmoedown, where it's like, oh, how do I help my competitors? Well, the most important thing to help my competitors is help them win. How do I get them a strategic advantage? Well, that's helping them study before the match and also during the match being keyed in and ready to challenge. And this is like the first instances where we kind of see that and we're like, oh, we're seeing the new type of manager before the new type of the manager and before the faction system.
Yeah. Grace in this group is interesting to me because she's to me is still type sort of like the old school type of manager where most of the stuff that you sort of felt like Grace was involved in that you knew about at the time was storyline stuff with Ken, and that whole weird thing about Eric Zipper joining corruption but not really joining corruption and all of that. Kaiser comes in at this time too, but I associate Kaiser so much more with the faction era. But the group here, I don't think Emma Fyffe gets enough credit for transforming the way the Schmoedown players prepared for their matches. Because you're right,
Absolutely.
the getting together and playing with the buzzers the night before championship match or a few days before championship match, whatever it was, like that carried on after Emma started that tradition, to the point that I was at Video Druid Nerd Chronic's house the night before Spectacular, the last live Spectacular. And in the kitchen, surrounded by a bunch of Schmoedown competitors and surrounded by buzzers practicing, was King Khan preparing for his match the next day. Like that's something that Emma started, and I don't think Emma gets enough credit for that. I don't know if it was necessarily Emma's idea or someone else in that Five Club's idea, but they transformed the way that things went. And I don't think they get enough credit for it. Roxy coming in with DC Movie News and then moving on to The Odd Couple. I forget, there was that weird period of time where DC Movie News crew was called The League. Do you remember this?
I don't. It's weird because even though like DC Movie News and like the League did technically exist and did technically, because I think not only Roxy was the manager, but like Johnny LaQuasta,
Johnny LaQuasto was also part of
that.
that.
It was like a co-manager, but like it felt like their competitor, like DC Movie News, had a lot of matches, and in Roxy and Johnny LaQuasta felt like only appeared for like 1/4 of them.
Yeah. They weren't really there much. I was actually kind of a little surprised when Roxy was one of the managers for Anarchy and got paired up with The Odd Couple. But she's turned out to be a fantastic manager in the end, really advocating for her players, especially as the game evolved in the faction era. Robert Meyer Burnett, we have to thank for the faction era, because in storyline, he's the reason we have it. And the faction era is my favorite era of the Schmoedown.
Yes.
So thank you to whoever made the decision, which I found, in retrospect, very odd to give that power to Robert Meyer Burnett to create the faction system.
Especially because it felt like once the faction system started, he was like the last old manager in a sea of new wave managers, if you will. And that definitely felt that way with his faction, kind of like his faction, the Burning Droogs at that time, just felt definitely like the odd man out, and definitely after his abrupt exit halfway through the season. So
I will say, though, he was a good manager for the family. The family is one of the best teams we saw in this era of the Schmoedown. I don't know that they necessarily could have hung with someone like Shazam all that often, or any of the teams that we had in the faction era, but the family were good. Andrew Guy flourished as a tag team player with Bateman and then with Drew McWeeny, and it was a great team. And Robert Meyer Burnett was a big part of that. So kudos to him for that. But yeah, when he came to the faction era and the Burning Droogs, he didn't. Well, he kind of left halfway through the season, anyways. Yeah. So it's not all on him, but that team was not very good.
It felt like every team decided to adopt the Emma Fyffe studying together thing in the faction era, except his team. Like, I don't want to get anything wrong, but I felt like you interviewed like every faction. It's like, oh yeah, we're all studying together before the match, we're getting ready. And you interview the Droogs, and it's like, oh wait, that player's on my faction. Oh nice. Like if I don't want to. I'm trying to do this off memory, but it definitely felt like a lot of the factions decided to take the step, like, go the extra mile, and the Droogs were still in the old system where well, I show up, I shoot some awesome promos, and I'm there for my competitor challenge wise, but before the match is before the match, and I don't have the like work it or like I don't work before the. I don't know. Again, I don't want to. I don't know enough about the Drew's behind the scenes situation to like,
Yeah.
but that's what
I
it
don't
felt like
either.
as a fan. It definitely
It
felt
it
like.
it did feel as a fan watching the shows as they were presented on YouTube that the Burning Droogs weren't much of a team the way the other factions were a team. And I don't know who that's down to, or if there wasn't study sessions happening, or if there were, I don't know. But that team definitely was a disaster in the first season of the faction era, and it only lasted that one season of the faction era.
Absolutely. And speaking of the faction era, that feels like this feels like the full new wave and the evolution of the Schmoedown. Because once again, the Schmoedown evolves again. By the faction system, it feels like now the Schmoedown is like 65 to 70% sport and
Yeah,
35% entertainment. The sports aspect is so much of a focus. And because of that, the managers feel almost like sports managers in this era more than any other era of the Schmoedown. We have Kaiser, Coy, Shannon, Winston, Sam Levine, Kate, and Adam Witt are all the big names that come to mind. I will say, especially Shannon and Winston making their managerial debut. And I talked about this during my favorite rivalries, but they both felt like, oh, they completely get it. Their factions felt like families and that they really work together. And it felt like, okay, this is like a sports team. We are practicing for your big match. We are going to train you and make sure you get there. And what also is interesting about this era, well, also quickly mention, is it felt like the manager had to be so in tune about challenges. And I remember during backstage when Ben Bateman hosted backstage, when he talked about managers and Sam Levine, a lot of the focus was like, well, Sam Levine has a huge advantage because he's a movie trivia Schmoedown champion. So when it comes to challenges, he gives you a strategic advantage because he is so quicker on knowing this movie trivia challenge stuff than any other competitor. And that's such a different conversation to what we were having previously about managers. It would be crazy talk if you were a Schmoedown fan and be like, man, listen, you like the Horsemen just have such an advantage because Roca is their de facto manager, so he can be so quick on the challenge trigger compared to like Finstock and Ricky Hayberg. Like there wasn't any talk or discussion like that on how the strategic advantages certain managers gave you, but that conversation started to have. And I'll also quickly say during the faction system, part of the reason it went this way is because I think people realized and Christian realized having a manager like Roxy, having a manager like Emma Fife, or once we get to the faction system like Kaiser, like Shannon, is just such a huge strategic advantage than not having a manager and having a
yeah,
whole team behind you. Because if you're a new player and you come in and you're not drafted to a team and you're placing some maybe another new competitor, let's say from the dungeon, well, the dungeon has a whole team behind them now working together and training this competitor. While this other new competitor, they're like, I was just told for movie trivia. There's no one that came with me, that studied for me, that told me about the new rules. So, like, the fact that the based on how strategic the Schmoedown changed to and how important the strategy was, it felt irresponsible in a way to not give new competitors or even old competitors managers. And it was like, well, everyone has to have a manager. You don't get a match if you don't have a manager because everyone has to have a manager at this point.
yeah. And that's one of the things that I disliked about season 9 was we went away from the everyone's on a faction, everyone has a manager, and so suddenly you had matchups of teams or players that had managers versus people that didn't, and I always felt like that was unfair because we'd gotten to the point where everything was so strategic, even if they were trying to make it loose and fun and not so sports like in season 9, everything had gotten to a point where you had to study this much or you were going to lose. You had to get help from someone studying or you were going to lose.
You
You
had to
had
know
to
about the
have a
game at
manage.
least.
You had to know the rules and everything about the game. And if you were a new player coming in, it was much easier if you were on a faction because you had a manager who knew the rules and everything of the game. We had, the rule book and everything by that point, and so many different like arguing over pronunciations and spellings and all kinds of stuff happening with the managers. I want to talk about Coy though, because I think Coy also fits into that category with Shannon and Winston of somebody who came in first time manager in the faction era and just got it. His was just with a different vibe than
Absolutely.
Winston and Shannon's. Coy definitely was one of my favorite managers to watch in the faction era. Um, he had great success with Shazam, and maybe didn't have the most amount of success with everyone else on his team, but you could tell his team had fun. They were a family. They enjoyed hanging out with each other. And one of my favorite memories from the spectacular I went to in 2021 was hanging out with the Real Rejects while Shazam was playing, and just their excitement to see Bibbs and the kid doing so well and defending their belt. And you could just tell that there was a great love and friendship among the people on Coy's team, and you could tell that about Winston's team, even though in storyline Chandru was a dick and everybody kind of hated him by the end, and he was trying to turn everyone against each other. You could tell that Shannon's corruption was a massive family, everybody appreciating everybody. And one of the things about the faction era that brought out strategy for the managers beyond just the game was the draft. And you got to see moments like Kate in that second draft going, I can't believe I get to draft Mark Riley. Are you kidding me? And just their excitement about the game, because I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I think the managers actually chose who they wanted on their teams. I don't think that was a decision from other people writing the storylines, and they just built the storylines based on the teams. I could be wrong about that. I don't want to be wrong about that though, because it makes it so much better that all that evolved organically because the managers had some autonomy to make those decisions.
I believe so, because if that wasn't the case, why the heck would so many rookies be drafted
Yeah.
so early? It doesn't make any sense if you're trying to do this as an entertaining thing. And you bring out a great point with Coy that I want to expand on as well. I think Coy doesn't get enough love as a manager because, first off, he also did not debut in the faction era. He was one of the managers that succeeded in the old system and succeeded in the new, because people forget his first managerial match was Wade, I know this, with Stacey Howard and Winston Marshall.
Yeah. In
And that
Anarchy.
he was incredible in that
He was
match. People
great.
like he was so entertaining and so in that live event setting, and he really, because that match I remember, I wasn't it was the debut match I believe for the founding fathers in the tournament.
Mm-hmm.
And people were like, well, I mean, the founding fathers are obviously going to win, but I credit the Winston, Stacy, and Coy. They all just brought their complete A game entertainment wise to make that match so entertaining and so fun and just like a great live event experience. And I'll also quickly say about that is you could even see some of Coy's managerial style, and I think Winston says this. With part of Winston's managerial style comes from Coy and Coy's managing in that live event of Winston. And I'll also quickly say another thing I'll say about Coy that I think shows how great he was as a manager is Perry Nemiroff. Because Perry Nemiroff is someone who it felt like she had a bad experience with the game early on, and Coy drafted her and brought her back and teamed her up with Joshua Horowitz, and it felt like Coy was so good at just being like, okay, and Perry Nemiroff is a great example of like, hey, this is a player that came in without a manager and didn't really like have the full tool set to succeed, because it is so hard to succeed within the Schmoedown without a manager at the beginning. And then the minute she got a manager with Coy, she started being a lot more competitive, winning matches, and also it felt like having a lot more fun. And I think she
Mm-hmm.
says this, she was having a lot more fun with Coy and being able to play the Schmoedown in with the Mercs and with Coy, and having a lot of people helping her succeed and giving her the tools to succeed. And that just shows you like what I love about me and Adelia are the same way. We both love the faction system. We truly, there's so much I can talk about with the faction system and loved it and why I was sad it went away in season 9. But part of it was like you had this team behind you that was supporting you, and it like that's what I love about sports is the best sports team that ends up succeeding, or even like just even if it makes a playoff spot, like the 7 or 6 seed that makes the playoffs when they weren't supposed to, but loses a game. Those teams feel real in fans' memories and their in the team's memories, and I think that the Cohen pairing them off is a perfect example of that moment where it's like, oh, this is the clear advantage of having a manager, and it's the clear because these quirky mercs teams, these championship winning corruption teams and the swag team that almost beat corruption that first year, they're all memorable and have their own sense. And you also mentioned Chandru being a dick in the storyline, but like I think a couple people have said this outside of the storyline, he was like one of the best team players within swag and always there to help his fellow swag members. And I think that made an interesting dynamic to the fact that he's supposed to play this like big heel trying to turn everyone against him, but like on the inside he's being the like glue guy, which is such an interesting dynamic that only the Schmoedown can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to look at like Andrew DeMolanta teaming up with Coy, becoming a champion. Winston coaching champions in Chandru. You know, like there's a lot about the faction system and the way the role of the manager was in the faction system that I think was really advantageous. And I know that we still technically had factions in season 9, but it wasn't the same. There wasn't like a goal to go for anymore. It was just kind of like there to advance storylines. We had the weird complete heel turn from Roxy and everybody on her team. Like there was a lot about season 9 that I just really didn't like, but the main thing I didn't like was it seemed like everything that there were stakes for in season 7 and season 8 was just gone, and it was back to the beginning, which the beginning of the Schmoedown, season 3 is when I started watching. That's when I fell in love with the Schmoedown. It was just a bunch of friends coming together, having fun, and playing movie trivia. But once they introduced stakes, I got super invested because I never once tweeted about the Schmoedown until it was the draft, the first draft, and I was like, "Oh shit, this is going to be really, really exciting." Because I'm a sports fan. This is the kind of stuff that gets me. I understand that a lot of movie nerds are not sports fans. That's fine, but I also think that some of the best matches we ever saw were when there were stakes. Even earlier in the Schmoedown, it was the tournaments gave it stakes, but when you had the stakes but somebody there to back a player up if something went wrong, or you know, there needed to be a challenge or whatever it was, the role of the manager was so pivotal in season 7 and 8 that I kind of hated that it just kind of became a thing in season 9.
And it just shows that to have a game where whatever place the game is at is the place the manager is at. Because in some ways, because again, in season 9, the faction system went away and it felt like the manager's main job. Yes, there were managers who were still all in on studying with their competitors and making it like a team. But it also felt like, okay, but now the managers are back to not trying to win for their own glory, but just to create storylines because it felt like the best way in season 9 to get your competitor matches was to create an interesting storyline for your competitor rather than to win in some ways. I also think I think it's very interesting because I think the going back to the non-faction system could have worked, but I think the biggest problem, and this will probably be its own episode. I'm very because there's an I do have there's I think there's a lot to talk about about the faction system itself, why it works, why it didn't work, where it could have changed, where it could have succeeded, where it could have fell. But I think one of the biggest problems the Schmoedown had in season 9 wasn't even about any of the systems. It was just specifically about the turnover. And it felt like you built up a certain level of consistency, and the Schmoedown never was good at slightly changing consistency, especially in the faction system. It felt like there had to be all these major overhauls and major redrafts. I remember one of the biggest things that drove me insane that they did was they're like, okay, at the beginning of the draft, we're going to have a keeper system. And then they did the keeper system, and then they had the draft. And then after that, they were like, okay, we're doing another keeper system. And I'm like, it drove me insane because like the part of it, like the reason sports teams don't every single year be like, okay, you're keeping 2 players and then you're switching is because you build to love these teams and then you
Yeah.
start to move. But I remember the reason why they did that was the whole Finstock exchange thing about the Finstock exchange being too stacked. And it was
And then
announced
it
when
turned
Finstock.
into the dungeon being really stacked.
Yes. So like I think the biggest problem when it came to the season 9, it felt like almost from the faction season, it was like we're gonna have a huge draft that shakes up everything. And then the next year we're gonna have a huge draft that shakes up everything. And then after that, we're gonna have a huge thing that shakes up everything. And it's like you need some consistency. And there has to
Consistency,
be
yeah.
change, obviously, but you can't have 3 straight years in a row where it's going to be a huge thing that shakes up everything. And like the season 9 factions was so extremely different from the season 8 and 7 factions. At least the season 7 and 8 factions, they feel like the same team mostly, except for the exchange. The exchange is 2 different teams, but that was just because of the whole rebrand.
And
Because they
drafting all
really,
those rookies in the second draft.
yeah, and like, but like, uh, I think a lot of like what could have made, again, we're getting into like the faction system, and this is about the
Yeah.
evolution of the manager. So I'll save a bit of it or a lot of it for when we do the whole faction episode. But I will say, like, um I think season 9, I actually like season 9 a lot. I think there's a lot of good in season 9, but I do
Hmm.
think there's also a lot that drives me nuts. But I think it's interesting they chose to go backwards to the. We'll get into it. I can't. I can't stop myself. Like once I start
Well,
talking about it, I can't stop.
we actually have scheduled next month in January to talk about the
Ooh,
faction system. So we'll
well,
get
that's
into
a
it next
tease for
month.
next month. It's a tease for next month. I'm excited because I literally have so many thoughts on the faction system, why
Yeah.
it worked, and once I start talking about it, I can't stop. As you see now, as soon as I even talk about it a little, I just like have to keep talking and talking and talking about it because there's a
Yeah,
lot.
I think that's why we planned to do this back to back, because we knew we'd
Yes.
have to talk to the faction system. I will say though that you can't have the faction system without the evolution of the manager to the point of all the strategy and the challenges and the this and the that. And I missed a lot of that in season 9.
Yes, I think there's still a part of it, and like the managers who are in season 9 all do their best. Like Adam Witt does a really good job, I think.
Adam
But
Witt was a phenomenal manager in season 9. Phenomenal.
absolutely, like he does everything so well. So Flirt and Flouse was a manager in season 9. Is that
Oh
correct?
God,
Or
yes, he was. He was the manager of Ty and Whitney's team that I don't remember the name of, because the less I think about Flirt and Flouse,
ruling class, I think.
happier and better it is for my mental health.
Yeah, that definitely like so for Flirt and Flouse definitely felt like a season 3 or 4 manager that was in season 9,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
shows you going back to like wanting to go back to the old seasons. But
yeah.
what's called Cade was really good in this season managing a heel Dan Merle and a heel
Bateman.
Ben Bateman. Turning on Saul was a huge story point, and like what I think it's interesting that when you think about season 9, or at least when me and you do, what we think about managerial wise is story moments. But when we think about season 8 and 7, when we think about huge managerial moments, it's choices in tournaments, like choosing this person over this person in a tournament. It's the challenges, it's the faction makeup, it's the draft. And in season 9, it's the storyline. And I think there's a lot to say about why that is. And
I
but it
guess.
is because of the focus. The focus on it was 60% sports during season 7 and 8, but during season 9 it felt like 70% 70% storyline, 30% sports.
Yeah, I guess what it comes down to in the end on which manager might be your favorite or which era the manager might be your favorite is how much you value the gameplay over the storyline. because in 7 and 8 it was all about the gameplay. I mean, a lot of that was because of COVID, and it was the digital era, and I know that they didn't look the way that people necessarily were used to with the studio matches and all of that. And that season 9, oh, we've got a studio again, let's change a bunch of stuff. I just didn't get that. You could easily have done what was happening in season 7 and 8 in season 9, I think.
I think we'll get into a next episode when we talk about the faction system. But I think a lot of like the faction system was blamed for a lot of the digital problems, which I don't think is which
I don't
were
think that's fair.
yeah, I don't think the problem was the faction system. I think the problem was the digital. And we'll get into that more next episode. But what I'll quickly end on my thoughts about the managerial and the evolution of the manager is the fact that no matter what the season is, the manager had one job, and it was to support its player. And depending on the season, there was a different way to do that. During season 3 and 4 and even 9, like the early seasons and the last season, the best way to support your character was to kick ass in the storyline and to make sure your competitors get matches because you were being a good draw storyline wise. You were drawing attention to your competitors. When it came to season 7 and 8, the best way to get your competitor matches was to win and to make sure they were well equipped in every single way. And that wasn't just strategic; it was also making sure they had a character plan. It's to make sure they knew what they were doing and that they not only were winning, but maybe even winning in style, maybe even helping them out. Because helping them storyline wise did not go away in the faction era. There definitely still was a place for making sure they were ready storyline wise and having a character and being ready to perform on stage. But winning was so crucial to getting matches that like the focus definitely was, hey, how's the best way I can help my competitor? Well, they got to win. They got to win. And that's the best way I can help my competitor. So it is interesting that like no matter what, you can kind of boil this down to this episode too, no matter what the circumstance is, the manager's job is to help their competitor any way possible, is to build them up. Depending in if the Schmoedown calls is more storyline focused, then you got to build them up in the storyline, and you got to kick ass in the storyline. And if the Schmoedown's more sports focused, well, guess what? We got to study, we got to focus, and we got to win, and then we got to prepare you the best you can because in a sport, if a coach sends out a rookie unprepared, that is a disservice to the rookie, but it's also a disservice to the coach.
Yeah. I've enjoyed the role of the manager in all the different eras of the Schmoedown. I think that the way that the manager's importance evolved was key to the way that the Schmoedown itself evolved. Some of the managers that never played a match, even if they appeared for a moment in a free-for-all, are some of my favorite people that were ever in the Schmoedown.
Absolutely.
And like we didn't talk enough. I want to have a whole episode about the dungeon at some point because we didn't talk enough about the dungeon in this episode. But next month we'll talk about the faction system of season 7, 8, and 9. Should be a good one because there's a lot to talk about there.
There definitely is a lot to talk about. It's one of the ones I'm the most excited for because this is the one where it's like when we were doing this is the first episode I wanted to create because this is like something I've been thinking about it festering because like as soon as the faction system started and ended, all I've thought about is the faction system, or not all I've thought about obviously, but a lot of my brain space is thought about why the faction system works and where it could be improved. Where were the tweaks, if you will, in the faction system?
Yeah, so we have a lot of things to talk about next month, but thank you everyone for joining us this month while we discuss the evolution of the manager and got slightly off topic at times. Josh, where can people find you?
Find me here on LGR. I'm going to be around, definitely in the nostalgia Crackdown, but maybe you'll see me in a review or two. Who knows? I'm always available and always happy to be around LGR. Support the LGR Patreon. It's great. It's a great service. You get to be a part of a great community. And, if you watch the fantasy football roundup, you can see my team absolutely get destroyed by Adelia this week in the playoffs. So I do want to also just quickly say congrats, Adelia. I'm rooting for you to go all the way after you beat me. So
thank you. I have never played fantasy football before. I played last year, and I played this year, and I still don't know what I'm doing, but I've somehow made it to the semifinals. So. Thank you for that, Josh. You can find the Patreon at patreon.com/LGR_network. $1 a month gets you into our Discord, where we hang out and voice chat practically all the time. And we just appreciate any support you have for the channel. So while you're here, why don't you go ahead and subscribe? We're getting close to 850 subscribers on the channel. I'd love to get there by the end of this year. I don't know if that's going to happen because by the time this comes out, there's only 2 days left in the year. But thank you to everyone for watching. You can find me on the Highlights channel on Starting 11, the English Premier League recap show. You can find me on this channel on the Rewatchers Council, our Buffy the Vampire Slayer series rewatch, where we're watching every single one of 144 episodes and doing a review of each episode. We're on episode 9 this week, I think. And we are also, you can find me, Ferris Mathana, on the Open Table Fridays, 8 p.m. Pacific, where we just have discussions like we would if we were at a dinner party with each other. We just did our Christmas episode, and we have our New Year's hangout this week. So check that out. Josh, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Can't believe it's 2024 already.
It's like, trust me, I'm like, oh my God, 2024.
I know. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and be sure to tune in next month for that faction conversation because it's going to be a good one. Until next time, we're out.
It's for real.